Se você deseja consultoria de qualidade, vem para o time Music.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to the education series. Today we're going to cover how to specifically set up pull, and then when I say that now, I know that the subtitles are going to say Paul. They literally just twigged in my head straight away because it's pretty funny. As I know a lot of you found that amusing in the last one, I certainly did. For those of you that are relying on the subtitles, I do apologise, but there isn't much I can do. At the moment, I don't have the time to manually input the subtitles, so they're done on an auto update, and they like to say that Paul is Paul. Although I do think that I pronounce them differently, but apparently I don't. So, how are we setting up pull? And specifically, the kind of volume parameters specific to the push-pull leg split, and then equally how we would approach a resistance profile perspective. Now, like I said in the previous video, I like to set my push-pull legs split up with push-pull, rest, legs, rest. And I was going to wait till this video to really get into another reason as to the specific kind of situation that I like to do that really means that those rest days either side of legs are kind of a must. Because I did get a couple of questions of what I think about 2 days on, 1 day off. And it's okay. The same reason as like 3 on, 1 off might be okay, but the increased frequency that 3 on, 1 off brings, I think, is brilliant. But the over fatigue aspect is then frustrating. The 2 on, 1 off does then increase the frequency slightly, but then it brings an issue where you're constantly going to have sessions back to back. That means you aren't specifically able to focus on a pull from the ground. So that was my reasoning for always going back to push, pull, rest, legs, rest. Because I'm firstly someone that really enjoys pulling from the ground. So the enjoyment factor there for me plays a big influence in wanting to prioritize the pull. Now, if I was a big squatter, it would be the same thing, because I would definitely want to be going into that session neurally fresh, focused, having had a day off the prior to that movement to then get as strong as I possibly could. For me, the deadlift, earlier on in my bodybuilding up till about 2017, was a huge priority movement for me. Knowing full well that it's never going to be a movement that is fantastic for muscle building, because the effort that is needed to be put into the exercise and what it takes away from you in terms of your recovery doesn't actually bring about huge amounts of hypertrophy. So we can quickly caveat into that because it's important, because I know that that topic, again, confuses a lot of people. The reason for that is because the deadlift is about mechanical advantages, in the sense that you're not using any one body part specifically to lift the weight when you deadlift. You're using a lot of knee drive, a lot of hip extension simultaneously, which then means that when you're simultaneously using those explosive muscles together, no single one muscle is forced to recruit all of its fibers necessary to create hypertrophy. Because hypertrophy occurs through massive amounts of mechanical tension. And that situation, what's going on there is that as we start to reach closer to muscular failure, and that rep speed slows down on heavy weights, and you start to see things about to grind, like you're grinding things out. Your body then is basically grabbing every single muscle fiber it can to do that work. And that's called the principle of size, where it will start off only doing the necessary amount of like muscle fiber recruitment to do that work. And as it gets to failure, it will grab everything. If you use really heavy weights, you're going to start getting into what are then deemed effective reps early on, which means then that from the very first rep, you might grab every single fiber. In high rep sets, it would only be the latter end of the set where you then start to do that. You're only going to accumulate those effective reps in those last grinding reps. In a deadlift, because of the spread of what's being used, there's no one specific muscle that really is grabbing all of its fibers together. What actually tends to happen is that there'll be like a mechanical breakdown, which then causes a lift inefficiency that then people struggle to overcome. That's largely what's happening. So from a hypertrophy perspective, it's less than ideal, but nonetheless very fun and something that I love doing, which then meant that for me, I always wanted to make sure that there was a rest after that day going into legs, because the deadlift, the conventional deadlift, is going to use some lower body, and then it's also going to generate some fatigue that I needed to recover from to be able to go into legs. When you're training those sessions back to back, it's simply not ideal, not necessarily just from like a neural recovery standpoint, but to actually train muscles on consecutive days is not a good idea. So deadlifting one day and then training your legs the next day is a pretty poor setup, because your leg fatigue is going to be apparent coming into that leg session, and then you're going to struggle to progress your lifts over a period of time. So that's my explanation as to why I always settled on push, pull, rest, legs, rest. And I didn't do a 2 on 1 off version or a 3 on 1 off version. Now again, that's not to say that these aren't things that you have to shy away from, because what can be done in the 3 on 1 off is you can deadlift potentially in legs, and you can stiff leg in legs. But again, I don't love the idea of training my back and then deadlifting the next day. For me, again, that brought about some mechanical breakdown issues, because I was a very strong, efficient deadlifter. Like in 2017, I pulled 380 kilos. You need your upper back fresh to be able to deadlift like that. Like when you're like a weaker deadlifter, you can get away with getting 5-6 plates off the floor with a fatigued upper back. But once we're talking 8-9 plates off the floor, everything's got to be fresh. So for me then, that setup reflected a real desire to do a lift that brought me a lot of happiness. In 2017, I actually stopped investing my energy into the conventional deadlift and started to really harp on about then changing the mechanics of the lift to then more efficiently load the lower back. And this is where I know for a fact that no one was talking about this before I was. I was the first one to start talking about how the deadlift is an inferior muscle building exercise compared to the stiff leg and the RDL. 2017, no one was talking about that before then. I started to hammer on about that endlessly because I was feeling it, and this is the thing, I learned everything I did through feeling things out. And I literally got to a point where I was like, the deadlift is bringing me nothing, but I still want to carry on lifting from the floor, and I still want to actually now specifically build muscle, which means the stiff leg or the RDL is now my tool of how to do that. So for those of you that are quite strong and your goal is then more specifically to build the thickness in your lower back, focus on the stiff leg deadlift. The stiff leg deadlift is not really going to add much of a difference to your lat development, although, and the reason for that is because the lat isn't lengthening and fully shortening. With that being said, if you're really, really, really strong at lifting off the floor, you'll notice that everyone's back that does that looks a certain way. Like my back when I was at its biggest looked a certain way. Like it was a smaller version then of how kind of Ronnie's back looked, well, a much smaller fucking version. But the shape is the same. James's back when he's just standing there is the same. And then even like a smaller version of a natural lifter, Keithy West, who is awesome, his back looks the same. You get more development in the lower lat all the way up to the top, just you're pulling from the floor. So although yes, it isn't an exercise that you would think is a lat movement, definitely not, that's a stupid thing to say. Success leaves clues, and when all of us that are good pullers all have a back that looks a certain way, Dusty as well, I forgot about Dusty, same shape back, that famous photo shoot picture of him standing there holding that barbell from behind, you can see that back look. So yeah, success leaves clues, which means then again, when you hear those say that, okay, the lifting things from the floor isn't going to develop your back as a whole, shut up. You have a naff back and you're weak. So you haven't built the back that I did, Dusty did, that James did, that Keithy West did. I'm going to leave Ronnie out of that because mentioning us in the same vein as Ronnie's just weird. So that's important, success leaves clues. And I kind of circle back to the last video of like when I was 12 years old. I was just watching what people were doing ahead of me and thinking to myself, okay, they did that, they look like that, I'm gonna do the same. Ronnie was pulling 9 plates off the floor, I'm gonna pull 9 plates off the floor. So if you want to build that level of musculature, that's how you need to approach it. So I've now kind of outlined the necessity for the rest days either side of pull to allow for a lift from the floor. I've explained how the conventional deadlift might not be the most ideal exercise for hypertrophy, and then you want to focus on the stiff leg. And then I've kind of hammered home that I feel the stiff leg to be a lower back thickness movement with a little bit of extra back development love thrown in there. And then reinforce the idea, if anyone tells you that it isn't going to make your back as a whole big, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. But hey. The specifics of the pull session itself. So for me, I would want to come in and always do my pull from the floor first, just because that's what that day was about. That day was about getting freaky strong off the floor on whatever movement I choose, and everything else falls into place after that. When I tore my lat last year, that had to change and I had to put a lat movement before it. So from a safety perspective, just consider how things feel once you start to get strong. Specifically why I got hurt, and actually this has been a reoccurring theme. I've got hurt when I've been pulling against band tension. And the reason for that, with leg pressing was the same, and when I hurt my chest it was the same. Overcoming that accommodative resistance at a point in the lift where you're all of a sudden not used to being able to develop that much force can sometimes kind of basically shock things. And it was all of a sudden you hit a wall at a different range in the lift than you're used to. So when we talked about how it's hard to get muscles short, so that force necessity at the fully contracted position is quite apparent. Our bodies are used to that. With accommodative resistance, that kind of slowing down of the rep speed happens earlier in the lift. So it's whilst the muscle is still slightly lengthened, that then you get that whoa factor of having to recruit more fibers. Each time that happened to me when I was at peak strength, I tore muscles. Really easy to explain why that happened, because our body isn't used to recruiting that level of muscle fiber or that kind of change in bar speed demand whilst the muscle's still lengthened. It is when it's shortened. So then that for me was why I got hurt in all of those situations. To overcome that thereafter, I did stick a lat move before my pull from the floor. So feel that out as to what feels great for you. Now, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to run through my favorite pull setup, and then you guys can go away, try it, see how that feels, and then kind of go from there. Pull from the floor first. Potentially the stiff leg deadlift. Standardize your form, keep your hips high, minimize knee drive. Important. Fed up of seeing exercises that are not the stiff leg deadlift, that are basically just a deadlift, where people keep tagging me in them. Please stop it. I won't reshare it. It's shit. If you want me to reshare your stiff leg deadlift, do a stiff leg deadlift. If your knee travels, it's not a stiff leg deadlift. The point of the stiff leg is to keep your leg drive out of it. So you're literally just bending over at the hip and you're standing up. And as the weight gets heavier and as you get closer to failure, your form doesn't change. So the same discussion that we had about logbooking and actually making progression, you cannot let your knees start to travel just to try to get more reps and more weight on the bar. It's poor. Don't do it. You will never ever see me ever have done that in the whole time I was pulling with the stiff leg variation, because it's shit and I hold myself to standards when it comes to pulls from the floor. So we've done our pull first. With that, I would do 1 to 2 sets. Sometimes it would only be 1, because I know that that's all I need, because again, like I mentioned in previous videos, I was just exposing myself to a stimulus that I've never done before. And I know that that's a very demanding lift in terms of the fatigue it generates across the week for me. So I just do 1 set of it. On weeks where I feel really good, I might then do a back off. 1 to 2 sets max. You do not need to do more than that on a lift like that. If you do, you're going to bury yourself. When you're weaker in the lift, the fatigue isn't going to creep up with you as much. But once you start stringing together lift progressions, regardless of your strength status, you'll feel it, because that demand is still high demand for you. So I really do advise only sticking to 1 to 2 sets on that. After that, I like to focus on a lat movement that emphasizes training things in the shortened position. So my favorite movement was either the single armed pull down on the prime machine that you guys may have seen me do a lot, or if I'm doing a dual armed version, it would just be something where my arms are kind of like slightly in front of me, just because then that's going to get a better contraction on the lat versus straight above. Because when you're straight above, you have to arch your chest. When you arch your chest, it emphasizes scapular retraction. So the goal of that lat movement is to avoid scapular retraction, because the lat doesn't attach to the scapula. Okay? It attaches to the top of the humerus and to basically the lower spine. So to fully contract the lat, we're thinking about driving the humerus into the spine. So it's a downward movement. It's not a retraction. This is super common knowledge. There's a video on my old channel from 2017 called How to Find Your Lats. So if you want to go back 5 years and look at when I first started talking about that, you can again look at that. 2017 was a real discovery year for me, actually. It was a year where I first started to really understand upper back versus lat recruitment, and it was the first year where I started to kind of understand the investments neurologically on exercises and understanding that the deadlift might not be superior. And I think that was because 2017 kind of came about because 2016 was again a discovery year where it was really deeply understanding training as a whole, the relationship to frequency, volume, intensity. So once I kind of ticked off that hurdle with things, when I moved into 2017, I was then just in this complete analytical process of trying to understand every component. So then again, there was a lot of discovery in 2017. And just whilst we're on the topic, the other thing that I stopped doing in 2017 is I stopped doing dumbbell lateral raises. Never did them again. And the difference was big. In 2018, which is where I was probably my most muscular, the development in my shoulders was hugely different from just focusing on machine and cable laterals. So I just thought I'd chuck that out there for the 2017 kind of revelations that I came across with myself. So yeah, how to find your lats, the difference between lat and upper back training. Now it's talked about endlessly. I don't really talk about it anymore because it's boring. Everyone else is talking about it. You can find that information anywhere. But I will say who needs credit in that area that I first started to learn from on it is Kasim. Well, whilst we're on the topic, Kasim first introduced me to the idea of it in 2014. It went over my head in 2014. I don't believe anyone was talking about that before Kasim. I know Cass was taught by Purvis, who was probably the very first instigator of that discussion, who I know is a very smart chap. I think his first name is Tom. I know his surname's Purvis. And he had a phenomenal understanding of biomechanics. So you can seek out some of his information. I never learned directly from Tom, but I did and still do continue to learn from Cass. Cass, I think, is absolutely fantastic. He is a very, very sharp mind. Before him and before Tom, definitely no one was talking about it. But yeah, 2014, it went over my head. In 2014, I was still way too obsessed with just external stimulus. To me, there was no internal stimulus. I had blinkers on to internal stimulus. All I cared about was how much weight could I lift. Really zero regard for standardization and anything other than taking a win from the session and progressing my logbook. But that was a very naive and foolish JP that still made progress because it got very strong, but didn't understand how to target my weaknesses. So yeah, 2017 was certainly a more of a revelation year for me. Once I've done my lat movement, which I always like to do first, Reason being, the lat is very hard to get short once it fatigues. So regardless of your strengths, upper back versus lats, and whilst I say that, very, very few people are going to have fucking awesome lats and then a naff upper back. That's rare. That's really rare. The only time I've seen that is with guys that have just bashed out tons and tons and tons and tons of chin-ups and that have never ever bent over holding a weight. That is where I've seen that situation. And there are a couple of those guys about, but that's rare. So always focus on that lat movement first, just because if you train your upper back first, you are going to get some crossover lat recruitment, but without really being able to fully target it, which then means that when you then go to progress your lat movement second, you're going to struggle to create lift progressions over a long period of time. Whereas when you focus on the lat movement first, it will be able to progress, and then when you focus on the upper back movement second, it will be able to progress. So again, I like to focus on a fully extended lat movement that then targets the lower lats. After that, I like an upper back movement that again biases the shortened position. So for me, it will either be a machine based that is harder in the contraction point, or it will be a seated cable row. Both of those, depending on what cable machine you have, depending on what machine you have, generally they're going to be hardest in the shortened position, just because most things are, unless they have an adjustable resistance profile. Now, once I've done my two movements for my lat and my upper back that focus on the difficulty in the shortened position, I then move on to another lat movement that then drops off in the shortened position, just because it's now going to be really, really hard to get my lat short. So this is where it's super key to have an exercise that does able you to adjust the resistance profile. Now, for a lot of you, you might just have hammer strength machines. And that's fine, because the single armed row backed away on the hammer strength machine is absolutely fine. And then we can just focus on driving that elbow down. Again, you'll see tons of people doing this. So all you need to do is step away from the machine and just be having your hand on the chest pad. Again, you're going to find some 2017 videos of me doing that on my old YouTube channel. If you have the option of adjustable resistance profile machines through the Prime, then take your pick. Do a single armed lat row on the Prime seated row machine. My favorite pieces for these are the gym shot pieces. And you'll see there's the pull down behind me, and it's probably just out of shot, but I've then got a seated row here. Those are phenomenal for dropping off in the shortened position. They were based on the original Nautilus machines, the Explode version, and they're the same thing. But most of you will have hammer strength pieces. If you don't have a hammer strength piece, I can't think of any other way off the top of my head to train the lat in the lengthened position, because everything else is going to bias the short, just because the lat is really hard to get short unless it actively drops off. So yeah, you're going to need to at the very least seek out somewhere that has a hammer strength machine. But hopefully, I see a lot more gyms now buying Prime. And then quite a lot of the gyms have got the gym shot pieces in as well, because they were very good. Now, once we've done that lat movement, we're then going to focus then on an upper back movement that equally drops off in the shortened position. So again, you can use, if you've got Prime, I would love the seated row, or the Pro machine row, the extreme row, or the upper back pull down on the Prime machine. But the point is that it's a pull first, it's a lat movement first, sorry, a lat movement second, but the first of the kind of lat versus upper back exercises that we do. Focusing on the short, upper back, focusing on the short, then lat, focusing on the lengthened, and upper back, focusing on the lengthened. So that's 5 movements, each of those at 2 sets each. If you have an area that's weaker, in terms of your lat versus your upper back, once you get to the second 2 movements, the ones that train the lengthened, add volume there. That is my advice. Do not add volume to the initial lat and upper back movements. And the reason for that is because as you start to progress your lifts, you'll find it harder to progress the sets in the latter part of the session, because you've created a lot more fatigue at the beginning. Whereas you're always going to be able to progress those latter sets of the session. If you run into a point where you then can't keep progressing them, you then know that you're doing too much work as a whole and you drop them back out. But you cannot progress everything all the time in terms of weaknesses. So add volume to either your lat or your upper back based on your weakness. And I would only just start by adding 1 set. I think that's all you need. But considering that the volume of the session would be 8 total sets of lat and upper back work at its lowest, we can then go to 9, and then potentially you could add 1 to the upper back as well, but you're going to need to play with that. So we're working it between 8 to 10 direct sets for lats and upper back every 5 days. After that, I would then always add a shrug variation, just because I always found that to get really crazy thick upper traps and lower traps, you aren't just going to get those alone from training the upper back scapular retraction variations. Some people believe you do. I didn't. I needed to specifically train the shrug. If you have super developed traps just from your upper back movements, you don't need to train the shrug. If you have a t-shirt on and I can't see huge slabs of muscle coming out from the back of your t-shirt, in my opinion, you need to train the shrug. And I take that analogy from Dante. Like, Dante was huge on the shrug. It massively influenced me to do the shrug, and then I saw really great development to my traps. Either before or after the shrug, depending on the balance of your physique, you would then also train the rear delts here. Now, how you train the rear delt, my preference was the rear delt row. And again, I learned that off of Kassim. Prior to Kassim introducing the rear delt row to the bodybuilding world, I don't believe anyone really knew that that exercise existed. If you were talking about that before Cass did in 2014, you're a super smart cookie and you're way ahead of everyone. But he was the first person that I know to talk of that, and that's who I learned that movement from. And it was, once I started to do the rear delt row instead of focusing on kind of just reverse pec deck type movements, either on the cable or reverse pec deck themselves, my rear delt development jumped hugely. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions of the rear delt row is that you will have your hands out all the way to the sides like this, and that's not the case. This situation here actually encourages more upper back. So when we think about the positioning of our elbows when we're doing rows, this will target the upper back more so. This kind of in between will focus the rear delt more so, and then really tucked will focus and dropping down to the more towards the hip, focus on the lat. In my opinion, if you want to learn the mechanical differences, I would go and check out Cass's content. He's much better at that than me, because that's his obsession, and he's brilliant at it. And that's who I learned from. Like and he's still putting out content now that is incredibly novel, because he's a very unique thinker. In my opinion, he's the best in the world when it comes to that. So I'm not going to go into YouTube content on that stuff, where it comes to kind of specifically targeting different aspects of the tricep and targeting different aspects of the glute, because it's not an area that I've been obsessed about or focused my learning on. It's simply an area that I have picked up from Cass, for example. So I'm not going to be one of these guys that then is going to do that content video on that and then just put my name to it like every other fucker out there does, because that's ridiculous. My area was working out how to train, how to get as strong as possible and as big as possible as a whole, understanding volume, frequency, intensity. Those were my areas that I was obsessed with. And that's why I'm able to sit here now, press play on a video, have no edits whatsoever, and just talk for however long this is going to be without content prepared, because I adore this topic. I couldn't do that on the areas that Cass can do. I would need to fully look things up in advance and make sure that I was like, okay, fuck, what was I trying to say? Whereas again, he can nail all that stuff. So go check out Cass's, great guy. So the rear delt row. So we're placing the rear delt either before or after the shrug, depending on our development. But I would still always focus on the lat, then the upper back, then the lat, then the upper back, then the shrug or the rear delt. Now, at the very end of this pull session, I might stick a couple of additional sets of biceps, just because they have pretty big fatigue resistance, and that I found that I could train my biceps at high frequency. So I could train them at the end of pull for 2 sets, and within 2 sleeps, I could then train them again at the start of legs. And that for me worked phenomenally well. And again, seeing as we're mentioning where things have come from, Dante was the one that introduced me to training biceps at the start of legs. Dante was also actually quite keen on biceps at the start of pull, when the pull volume was very low, and also your strength was kind of more at the beginner to intermediate phase. So on his some of his variations of his programs, he did favour that, as he found the bicep work didn't take away from the back work. I don't love that approach. I used it for a period and it worked for me in kind of like my infancy with my training. As more of an advanced trainee on my push-pull leg setup, I didn't use that approach. I would put biceps at the very end. And the other reason for that was I was happy to train them fatigued, because I knew then that in 2 sleeps time, they'd actually then get trained fresh at the start of legs. So that was always my preference of that setup. And again, it would just be a couple sets there, because I know they've only got 2 sleeps until I can expose them to more volume at the start of legs. But I'll go into that session when we get there. So yeah, that's where we're at, guys. So we're at 8 to 10 sets of direct back work, 1 to 2 sets of pulls from the floor, 1 to 2 sets of shrugs, 1 to 2 sets of rear delts. There is the potential to add more volume to the rear delt if you have machines that have adjustable resistance profile and you kind of have underdeveloped delts. You could then do a 3rd set and you could then just solely train the rear delt in the lengthened range for that 3rd set. If not, I'd stick to 2 sets, because that additional work you're going to do is going to end up being junk volume, because you're not going to be able to fully take the sets to failure unless you did a rear delt row where you then had someone assist you to get things fully short. Kind of like how I talked about in the push video, the actual training session in the push video. So yeah, that's that, guys. I hope that's helpful for you. Any questions that I didn't cover, please ask. I know that what I'm going to get in the comment section is, shall I use this machine or that machine if I don't have it? It's just impossible for me to answer, guys. Like, you're going to need to seek out the necessary pieces of kit if you want to make crazy progress. If you are still in kind of beginner phases, then you don't need to worry about resistance profiles, which then means really you don't need to be on the push-pull leg split. If you're on this split, it's because your development necessitates it, and at that level, I would then be wanting to seek out machines that allow me to do the job as optimally as I can. I know that's not entirely realistic for everyone, because you have jobs, you have limitations, and that's fine. So in that situation, just do the best you can. Then basically just train hard. Train hard in the order of movements that I said. One helpful thing is that if you have hammer strength pieces, use them first. Use those as your pieces that are your lat shortening and your upper back shortening, because the hammer strength pieces, all of them, are really hard to get short. So use those first. And then after that, if you're going to train the lat, you can at least step off. If you don't have that machine, after training the hammer strength pieces first, a cable machine will have a more even resistance profile than a hammer strength machine. I'm pretty sure I've covered everything there.
Oh, wow.